Perfect. So we are going to talk about the art and science of making chocolate. A little bit history. Chocolate, and I'll put it in quotes and I'll explain why, has a long, complex history that it's worthy of a whole separate session. I'm going to touch on a couple dates in the history of chocolate, and I put chocolate in quotes because chocolate really was a drink for most of its history. Was not a bar, and we'll get to that. But the earliest evidence they have of the use of cacao, which is the plant that produces chocolate, is about 1500 BC. These are the Olmec people, and they then transitioned to the Mayans. The Mayans used a chocolate drink. It was cacao mixed with spices, no sugar, as part of ritual ceremonies. Later, the Aztecs used cacao. They, in fact, used the cacao beans as currency. And there's actually evidence and translations that they've made of how many beans would mean like a tomato or a ear of corn. Obviously, in the 1500s, as the explorers sort of went around the world, they discovered cacao and they brought it to the New World. It was a drink of the rich for much of the time. Again, the aristocrats, because it was so expensive to bring over. And then eventually they actually introduced sugar into the chocolate. And that's really where you first get this creation of what we would consider sort of a hot chocolate. And there were hot chocolate cafes that eventually opened up. And it wasn't, if you look here on the bottom right, it wasn't until 1847 that the chocolate bar was actually created. And it was a company in England, Fry and Sons, that created the first chocolate bar. Now from there, because of the industrial manufacturing process, they were able to make it cheaper, and it transitioned chocolate from something for, again, the rich to something that many people could afford. Okay. Chocolate, Theobromine cacao is actually the name of the tree that grows the cacao pods. Theobroma means food of the gods. So if you ever hear that phrase, that's what it comes from. As I mentioned, it comes from a tree. Chocolate actually grows on trees, and you can see one of the pods here. There are a couple really interesting things about this tree. The first is you'll notice the fruit actually grows on the trunk of the tree. That's unusual. Most fruits, if you think about it, grow on the branches. This is not the case with cacao. This type of a tree is called a cauliflora. And there are other plants that are also this type. Coffee is one that you may know of. Jackfruit is another. Jaboticaba is another. And what's interesting is there are actually many different varieties of cacao that exist. You can see some variability here in the shapes, colors, size of the pods. It used to be, the thinking was there are really only three varietals, Trinitario, Criollo, and Forastero. It turns out that now with genetics testing being much cheaper, they've actually done genetic analysis of these different trees that grow pretty much along the equator. It's about plus or minus 15 or 20 degrees north and south of the equator where the trees can grow. They need warm temperatures both day and night. But they've started doing genetic analysis. It turns out there are at least a dozen different genetic variations. And the other interesting thing is that there are very few pure varietals. What does that mean? It means that most of the cacao that exists in the world today are actually mixes, they're hybrids of the different types of cacao that they're discovering. And through gene analysis, genetic analysis, they can really look at these and say, oh, this one is half of this varietal and half of that varietal, or maybe it has 10 different pieces of genetics from these different trees. As I mentioned, only grows near the equator. There's only one state in the United States where they commercially grow cacao, and that's actually Hawaii. Now it's considered the Arctic of cacao. I think most of the Hawaiian Islands are a little bit beyond the 20 degree. They're at 20, 22, 23 degrees north of the equator. It's a bit cold for cacao, but you can actually travel to the islands and get chocolate that's both grown and manufactured on the island itself. These pods, the result of a little flower that grows off of that trunk. And there's only one specific little fly, it's called a midge, that actually goes around and pollinates all these flowers. So it's the honeybees won't do it. You could get some maybe from the wind, but typically it's this little midge. The other interesting thing, and you can see here how they grow off the trunk, they have to be hand harvested. So a lot like coffee as well, coffee little seeds, beans are hand harvested. And the reason that's important is because if you were to, instead of cutting them, if you were to machine and shake them or something like that, you actually damage the tree, it damages the trunk, and it actually produces fewer flowers the next year. So in order to maintain the crop, they actually have to go in and hand cut every one of these pods off the tree, off the trunk. Now, what's inside of each of these pods? You actually have these seeds. There's actually a string of seeds. It's about 50 or so different seeds, and you'll see that they're covered with this pulp, this white pulp. That white pulp is delicious. If you ever get a chance to travel to Ecuador or Costa Rica or Puerto Rico, and you have a chance to get a cocoa pod, break it open and suck on these seeds. It's like tropical fruits. Now, don't bite into the seeds. They're very bitter, very, very astringent, not a pleasant experience, which makes sense, right? If you think about what the goal of this tree is, it's to get the seeds to germinate. So if you make a sweet pulp, well, the monkeys and our people will go in there, suck on these seeds, and they're not going to chew on them. So they'll either swallow them and then excrete them, or they'll suck on them and throw them. And so that's the way that this pod, these seeds, really help themselves in regenerating. And you can see in the middle there is a little seedling that I've been growing next to some of the pods. Obviously, those didn't come from that little seedling, but you get a sense for sort of how big those can be. So what happens with all these seeds? They actually get typically unusual. It's the responsibility of the farmer to actually harvest and break open all these pods, and chocolate actually ferments. They actually have to ferment these for about a week. And unlike, let's say, the wine industry, where you have a vineyard, somebody who grows the grapes and delivers those grapes to a winemaker, and the winemaker ferments those grapes, it's actually the responsibility of the farmer or the co-op. And I'll say co-op because about 90% of the world's cacao is actually grown on small family farms. This isn't big agra. These aren't giant plantations typically. These are, let's say, 3, 4, 5 acre farms. And a lot of times these families will come together and they'll do a fermentation as a group. And you can see this is actually in Hawaii. This is one particular farmer. He has a little fermentation bin. And the fermentation is actually a 2-step fermentation. We're going to get a little bit into the science here. So the first step, the first part of the process is actually a fermentation that involves yeast, so much like wine. In this case, remember that sweet pulp that I was telling you that's around those seeds? Well, that yeast is going to eat that sugar and turn it into alcohol. That alcohol is going to soak into those seeds, and it's actually going to kill the seed, which is what we want. You don't want those to start germinating. And then the second step is actually with a bacteria. And this is exactly like a vinegar. So if you want to make vinegar, you actually take grape juice, turn it into wine, and then an acetobacter will turn that wine into acetic acid, turn the alcohol into acetic acid, and then you have vinegar. Well, same thing here. The sugar gets turned into alcohol by the yeast, and then the bacteria will turn the alcohol into acetic acid or some acids. And again, those infuse into the seed, and it's a really important process. But they say it develops the chocolate flavor precursors. That means those flavor compounds that are what we consider sort of chocolatey flavor. That's really a part of this fermentation process. It takes about a week. It can happen typically on the ground, just in a pile with banana leaves. The yeast comes from the air or from sticking to the banana leaves. Most, I would say, higher end, what we'll call fine flavored cacao, they're now fermented in bins, wooden bins. They're trying to control that process a little bit more. But I would say the cacao industry is still in the dark ages compared to, let's say, the wine industry. A little bit on chocolate basics. So we'll talk about the ingredients, where they come from. One of the interesting things about chocolate, you'll notice, is that even though I've seen some reports that 1 billion people eat chocolate on a daily basis every day, there's very few people that actually make it. Why is that? You know, you read about it in stories when you're a kid, you eat it, you get it at the stores. So it's because it's actually a fairly complicated process. It's a multi-step processing process. It's a mix of really physics and chemistry and culinary skill that has to come together just right to make what you would consider really good quality chocolate. And we're going to talk about what those steps are, what the ingredients are, what some of the tricks might be. So let's start with ingredients. 4 ingredients is all you need to make any chocolate you want. Okay, whether it's a white, a milk, a dark chocolate. And those 4 ingredients are cocoa nibs, cocoa butter, sugar, and milk powder. Okay, so let's talk about where, I mean, you know where sugar comes from. Milk powder is essentially milk that's been evaporated, so all the water is out of it. But nibs and cocoa butter. So cocoa nibs are actually pieces of the cocoa bean. So as I mentioned, you start with the cocoa pod. Those seeds are then fermented. When the fermentation is done, they're laid out on the ground to dry. And that's typically what's sold to chocolate makers or anybody who wants to make chocolate, is these dried fermented cocoa beans. They're then roasted. Okay, so you can put them in the oven. They use coffee roasters. There are special cocoa bean roasters as well. And those cocoa beans actually have a shell on them. So the next step after you roast is to actually crush them up to release the shell. And then usually they use either an airflow or a vibration table to separate the pieces of that cocoa bean from the shell. And what you're left with are called cocoa nibs. Okay? So if you ever see that term, it's essentially just the roasted pieces of that broken up bean. Now, where does cocoa butter come from? It has the word butter in it, but it's not dairy. It doesn't come from a cow. It's actually the oil, the fat, that's in those nibs. Most cocoa nibs are about 50% fat, 50% cocoa butter. Okay, so how do you get that butter out? Well, you can either grind up those nibs or put them in a press. And if you heat it up and warm it, well, an oil comes spilling out. And you're also left with this hard puck, hard, dark colored puck. And if you grind up that puck, that's cocoa powder. And the fat that came out is cocoa butter. And it's a solid at room temperature. Obviously, you eat chocolate that's full of cocoa butter, and it's hard at room temperature. So those are the 2 primary ingredients. That's how they're, where they originate. A little bit on sort of different chocolate types. As I mentioned, those 4 basic ingredients, the nibs, sugar, cocoa butter, and milk powder. And just to give you an idea of what's the difference between a dark chocolate, a milk chocolate, and a white chocolate. Well, if you've ever seen a 100% dark chocolate bar, or sometimes they call it baking chocolate that you might cook with, or you're making a chocolate cake, that's 100% cacao, okay? And that could be primarily nibs. If you then have a dark chocolate, it might say 80% cacao. That means it's a mix of nibs and sugar. You see that next. If you have a European style chocolate, dark chocolate, typically what that means is they've added extra cocoa butter to it. And that extra cocoa butter gives it that sort of rich, creamy flavor that we love, which is also why milk chocolate tastes so delicious. It's got a lot of sugar, a lot of cocoa butter, milk powder, which adds even more sugar and fat. And you see it's sort of a somewhat equal distribution. And then finally, white chocolate, which is made out of sugar, cocoa butter, and milk powder. So no nibs, which is why it stays white. Okay, so that's sort of the basic ingredient breakdown. And I'll get into cocoa percentage a little bit later. On the cacao itself, the nibs, It turns out, I mentioned that it's grown sort of north, a little bit north and south of the equator, and it's grown in all these different countries, right? So Central South America, Africa, Vietnam, the Philippines. And it turns out that where it's grown, and as I mentioned, there are lots of different variants of this plant, that they all have different flavors. And it's a combination of the yeast and the atmosphere, you know, what the terrain is like. They call it terroir, right? That has an effect on the flavor of this agricultural product. And so that's one way that you can really enjoy chocolate, is by tasting these different cocos that come from different countries. And again, this is a lot like coffee, a lot like wine, where depending on what variety is and where it's grown and how it's handled, you can get these really interesting flavor profiles. So if you go to a craft chocolate maker, you'll often see these are called single origin chocolates, which means that the beans are coming from one particular country or even one particular farm. And so you're going to be able to taste that particular flavor. For example, Madagascar, it says fruity. To me, if you have a chocolate bar that's made with beans from Madagascar, it tastes like dark cherry. Burgundy cherry has been added to it, but it hasn't. It's just native to the bean itself. So a little bit on the chocolate making process, the steps. And whether you're an industrial maker or a home maker or a craft chocolate maker, typically you have to go through all these same transformational steps, and I'll discuss them a little bit here. So the first is you put the nibs in your machine and you're going to grind them. And as I mentioned, they're 50% cocoa butter. So as you start grinding them up and you warm it up, it looks like you know, chunky peanut butter, right? The oils get released. It's still got pieces in it, but it will turn sort of liquidy. And that's really the first step in the process. You then can add other ingredients, sugar, milk powder, flavorings if you want. Put them in, and you're now going to do what's called refining. And this is one of the longer steps in the process, and it takes a long time because you have to take those pieces of nibs and the sugar and grind them down a lot until you get to about 20 micron particle size. Okay, so a micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. Your hair is probably about, let's call it 100 microns. And you want each little piece of sugar broken down so it's less than 20 microns. Okay, so why is that important? It's important because your tongue can detect grittiness at about 30-35 microns. And so once you grind it down to about 20 microns, your tongue is not going to be able to detect the pieces, and it'll just going to taste creamy and smooth. And so you have a really pleasant texture to the chocolate. The next step is conching. It's called conching because the original machine that was developed had a screw that looked like a conch shell. And it's a bit of a controversial step. Some people do it, some people don't. But what it is, it's an elevated temperature. So let's say around 120 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Slow manipulation or stirring of the chocolate. Now, if you've ever gone to a chocolate factory, whether it's Hershey or a Ghirardelli, you may be seeing a large vat of chocolate with a giant roller sloshing the chocolate back and forth. That's a conching step. And what it's doing is it's aerating the chocolate, it's heating it, and it's volatilizing or evaporating some of those flavors that are in there. And that's sort of the controversy around it, which is some people say, well, why do you want to get rid of flavor? Well, if you start with beans that maybe have some off flavors or some flavors that are very intense, you may want to volatilize or remove some of that flavor. And so you can do that by heating it and aerating it. But a lot of people say, well, if I start with really good quality beans, I want to maintain all that flavor. I want that intensity. So they won't really do a long conching process. Okay, the next step is tempering. Some of you have heard of this. You may have even done it. I'm going to get into the science of tempering. I actually have multiple slides on this so that I can explain it to you. You will understand the science of tempering. And then once the chocolate is tempered, it's still liquid. And then gets put into a mold where it hardens or crystallizes. And then at that point, you can eat the chocolate. Okay, so let's get a little bit into tempering. So the first important thing to understand about chocolate is that it's a suspension, meaning it's fat, as I mentioned, cocoa butter, and there's a lot of pieces that are floating in that fat as a liquid, right? There's no water in chocolate. You don't want any water in this process. Very bad for chocolate making, okay? And the interesting thing about cocoa butter, the molecule, it's a fat, it's a triglyceride, is that it's called a polymorph. Poly meaning many, morphs, there's different shapes. It turns out that that fat can connect to other cocoa butter molecules in 6 different ways. And each of those different ways of forming and connecting has a different and that helps us. And it's only one of these crystal types, and it's that number 5, that Roman numeral 5 that you see in the orange. That's the one that we want. We want all our chocolate to be in what's called form 5, which means tempered chocolate. Now you notice there's a form 6. Form 6 actually doesn't get created in a cooling process. It only happens in a solid chocolate if it sits for a very long time. So we actually don't have to worry about that one. And you look here, this picture, this interesting pattern. This is a chocolate that I made, and you notice the little sort of darker, shiny spots. That's actually form 5 crystals that were in this chocolate that crystallized some of the fat around it, but there wasn't enough to actually crystallize the whole chocolate properly. So you'll see it's untempered, or it's not fully tempered. And so you can see a really neat pattern that forms there. So let's get a little bit more into, and I'm using Legos here to try to simplify the explanation. So if you can find a bunch of 2x4 Lego blocks, what's interesting about them is you can connect them in a repeating pattern in lots of different ways. Here's 3 that I'm showing you on the right. Right, it's the same piece, and I can connect in a pattern. Okay. Again, the same thing with cocoa butter. It can connect to other cocoa butter molecules in these patterns or crystals in different ways. Now, what we want is only one particular crystal. In fact, we want small pieces. So on the left, you'll see if you have, imagine each of these Lego blocks is a cocoa butter molecule. Imagine that they're all melted, which means they're not connected to each other in any way. As I cool the chocolate, some of them are going to start connecting. And the ones that the more stable structures, the one that can connect at the higher temperatures will form first. And so I just want a few of those, about 1 to 3% of these little crystals in my melted chocolate, which then when it hardens, will create sort of the scaffold, the crystallization starting point, and then I'll end up with tempered chocolate, okay? And this is what it looks like. If you want to temper chocolate, you actually have to take chocolate through this curve. So imagine that you start with chocolate, maybe it's at room temperature. The first step is this melt step. And as long as I bring it up to above 94, most people say bring it to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, then I'm going to melt all the crystals, and now I'm going to get liquid chocolate. Then the next step is a cooling step. And what I want to do is bring that chocolate down and get it into that form 5 crystallization zone, right? So between 84 and 94 degrees Fahrenheit. And as I bring the chocolate through and I stir that chocolate, the combination of that temperature and the stirring will create those seed crystals, form 5 seed crystals. Okay? Now I may drop below that form 5 zone. I may even go into the form 4 zone, which is okay, because what's going to happen is if I warm up that chocolate a little bit and get it to about 90 degrees, I've created enough of these form 5 crystals. I can melt away any of the form 4 crystals because they can only live, right, if the temperature of the chocolate is about 84 degrees or below. So if I bring my chocolate to 90 degrees, then I will have what we call tempered chocolate. And there are a couple different ways of doing this process. Okay, so the first is what's called table tempering. I don't know if you've seen this. It requires a lot of skill. It can be very messy. And what you do is you melt chocolate, you take about 2/3 of the chocolate and you pour it onto a stone slab. And you get literally paint or spackling, I don't know what you call them. They're not quite brushes, but paddles. and you spread the, like spatulas, and you spread the chocolate on the table to cool it, and you scrape it back together. You want to keep the temperature of the chocolate fairly uniform. And you do that multiple times until the chocolate, again, is sort of in that form 5 zone. And then you take that chocolate and you pour it back into the 1/3 of the warmer chocolate that you left in your bowl, and that does the remelt, right? So it'll get rid of any of those form 4 crystals that might exist. And then you'll end up with tempered chocolate. At that point, you can pour it into your mold. If you don't want to learn how to do that, again, I mentioned it can be complicated, you can get a tempering machine, and there's a machine that will go through that process, that will manage the temperature, it'll heat it, it'll cool it, etc. And the final process, this is something that you may have done, is called a seeding method. And what happens is if you have chocolate chips or a chocolate bar, you break it up, you can put the chocolate into a microwave, you can slowly melt it, be careful not to burn it. And you only do that with, let's say, about 2/3 of the chocolate. And once that chocolate is all melted, you can then take the chips that are available, that are left, and you can put them back in and then stir it around, and you're seeding it. So the crystals that are in the tempered chocolate that you had, that you threw in at the end, will now go into that melted chocolate, and you will end up with, again, tempered chocolate. Okay? So a little bit on why we eat chocolate. So a couple things. Well, obviously, it's delicious. It tastes good. It has sugar in it. It has fat in it. You know, it's something, you know, if you like, you get a sugar high, why not? It does have a stimulant in it. It's not caffeine, but it's something called theobromine. There's no bromine in theobromine. It comes from the term Theobroma cacao. And I'll get into some of the science of theobromine in a little bit. But there are health benefits to chocolate, and I'll say dark chocolate, because it's the darker pieces, not the fat and not the sugar, but the darker component, which they've proven has an anti-inflammatory effect. It's an antioxidant. It can help with memory. It has a benefit to the heart as well. So lots of reasons to eat, I would say, darker chocolate, and the darker the better. Okay. So chocolate making itself, machinery and processes and all that, we're going to get into some of those details now. Industrial chocolate making process, big machines, each step in the process has its own dedicated machine. And as I mentioned before, right, you're going to have a grinder, you're going to have a refiner, you're going to have a conch, you're going to have a tempering machine, you're going to have a dispensing machine, a molding machine, and then it's going to go through a cooling tunnel to finally produce a bar of chocolate or a piece of chocolate. But this is big equipment, it's expensive equipment, not necessarily something somebody's going to do at home. There is a DIY home chocolate making process. I will admit it's a bit messy, it can be complicated, it can take a day, 2, 3 days even. But I'm going to go through it just so you have an idea of what that process is like. So first off, grinding. You can get a champion juicer, and that step will, we call it, do the grind, the pre-grind. It'll take either nibs and liquefy them. Some people will actually put the nibs, with the beans with the shell on them after they've been roasted, and this champion juicer will be able to sort of de-shell it as well. You can take that molten chocolate. At this point, it's called liquor, chocolate liquor, which just means it's 100% just ground up nibs. And you can put it in what's called a wet grinder, a refiner, a melanger, an Indian spice grinder, which is, there are a couple stones, round stones, that are spinning on a stone platform. And you can get these on Amazon. You can get them, I'll tell you, a couple places as well. And what you're going to do is put your ingredients, your ground up chocolate, your sugar, any vanilla, any spices that you want into this melanger or grinder. And it has a tension wheel. You'll see right in the middle there, that white dot allows you to actually control the tension on those stones. So when you're refining, you actually want to tension, you want to put tension so they're grinding hard. And that process can take a day to both refine and conch, or longer. Some people will go actually 2 days, 3 days. But if you're obviously conching in this, you don't want that tension, because you can over refine. These particles, these pieces will get smaller and smaller. And you don't want to make them too small, because then the chocolate actually, when you eat it, will have sort of that peanut butter taste in your mouth, that sort of stickiness to it, which is why you want to stick to about 15 to 20 microns. Again, you can buy a tempering machine. This is a little sort of 1.5 pound, 2 pound unit that's for home, and temper the chocolate that way. Then you can dispense the chocolate, and you can use a piping bag. This is used for decorating cakes, very much available. It's like essentially a plastic bag or cloth bag. You can put the chocolate in there. Some people will use actually syringes, very large syringes, and they'll suck up the chocolate, and you can get molds, either polycarbonate molds or PET molds. You can get those on Amazon as well. And then you bang the chocolate on the table to flatten it out, get the bubbles out, and eventually, if you tempered your chocolate properly, you will have delicious chocolate that you can eat at home. I'm going to talk a little about CocoTerra, because what we've tried to do is really simplify that process. As I mentioned, there's lots of different pieces of equipment. It can take multiple days. So what CocoTerra has done is really created the first tabletop chocolate maker for the home. So it's one machine which will grind and refine and conch, temper, dispense, mold, and cool. And instead of 2 days, it actually only takes 2 hours. It makes about a ½ pound of chocolate at a time. I'm sorry to say we're not selling them yet, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this for now, but I'll give you more information about it later if you want to learn more. So one of the reasons, benefits of making chocolate at home is actually sort of this global benefit. The first is understanding where your food comes from. As I mentioned, cacao is grown on these small family farms. Being able to connect to the origin of these foods, and also if you appreciate the fine flavors, that means that these farmers will grow better cacao instead of less, higher yielding but lower flavor cacao. It also means if organic is important, then they'll grow organic, and we want to make sure also that we support the farmers. That means you can get fair trade. There are lots of different programs that make sure that farmers are getting paid fairly. There are also some issues of children being used to harvest cacao. You want to make sure that the cacao that you're getting is traceable and is ethically harvested. We also want to make sure that it's good for the environment. So we don't want rainforest being cut down. This crop actually can be planted within forest. It grows natively. It's an understory crop, so it grows actually underneath the canopy. So it can be planted within the forest. And also biodiversity. As I mentioned, there are lots of different genetics. There are some companies that are pushing, particular, varieties or genetics, which are high yielding, and some people say are not very good flavored cacao. And we want to make sure that we avoid that and stick to a biodiverse system. And in terms of customization or personalization, there are lots of ways that you can personalize your chocolate. And here are a few. Obviously, the chocolate type. So whether it's a dark milk or a white, and whether it's 50% or 75%, you can fully customize that when you're making chocolate. We talked about sort of the origin and single origin. And maybe having blends of those as well. Roasting, as I mentioned, you can literally get a pan, a cookie sheet, and put these beans in your oven. And you can, the same way that coffee is sort of light, medium, and dark roast, same is true in chocolate, and it can affect the flavor tremendously. You can always add flavorings, spices. You can have inclusions. That means pieces of, let's say, nuts and dried fruits. You can even decorate your chocolate. If you've ever gone to a fancy truffle shop, they have these little decorations. You can see one here. It's called a transfer sheet, and it's literally colored cocoa butter that you can transfer onto the molten chocolate. Lots of different molds you can play with, and then if you're giving this chocolate to someone, obviously you can have lots of different boxes and wraps and foils, which makes it very exciting to gift. And here's some chocolates that we've made on our machine. You can see there's something interesting about them. We actually produce a ring of chocolate. So it's like a bar, but the ends connect up with each other. Again, you can have a milk chocolate on the left, a white chocolate. This is called Ruby, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Again, if you want to decorate your chocolate, the blue one is a hand-painted chocolate. You can get colored cocoa butters and color your molds. The ones on the right there are using transfer sheets. There are lots of beautiful patterns that you can put on chocolate. And again, you can flavor and put in inclusions. So the one on the left there is a toasted almond and raisin chocolate. The one in the middle is a white chocolate with crushed up candy canes. And on the right there is a chocolate with coffee in it. So if you like sort of that mocha flavor, you can add all sorts of interesting flavors. But again, you don't want anything that has water in it. So no fresh fruit, only dried fruit. No fresh herbs, only dried, typically powders, right? Cinnamon, cardamom, that you could even put chili powder in into your chocolate. So a couple fun facts. Again, this is if you want to be a true chocolate geek, you should know these things. The first is cocoa and cacao, cacao and cocoa. Which word do you use when? Well, there isn't really a hard and fast rule. I'll tell you what I've heard, and you can, I think, decide for yourself. But one way of distinguishing is that if it's the plant or the raw product, then it's cacao. So it's a cacao tree and a cacao pod, and they're cacao seeds. But then once you transform it, you take it through some process, then it's cocoa. So these are going to be cocoa beans and cocoa nibs and cocoa butter and cocoa powder. I've talked to somebody else who said, no, you know what? This is just cacao is Spanish and cocoa is English. And that's a different way of differentiating the words. But you're not going to get it wrong. I've actually changed the wording over time, and so you find something you're comfortable with. Okay, white chocolate. I try to stay away from chocolate politics. A lot of people say white chocolate isn't really chocolate. So I'm going to give you the facts, and you can decide for yourself if white chocolate is chocolate, using quotes. Again, going back to those 4 ingredients, right? Nibs, sugar, cocoa butter, and milk powder. Well, white chocolate is, right, sugar, cocoa butter, and milk powder. No nibs. Okay, but do you remember where cocoa butter comes from? It comes from the cocoa nibs. Half of those nibs are made of cocoa butter. So that's why people call it chocolate, because the ingredient, the cocoa butter, comes from the cocoa beans, the nibs. That's the facts, and you can decide whether you think it's chocolate or not. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people only eat white chocolate, some people will never eat white chocolate. So you can decide where you are in that battle. Okay, cocoa or cacao percentage. It's actually written different ways on bars. But you saw this chart before, and I'm going to give you an idea of what that means and how you can actually calculate what's in your bar. So the first thing is you can have a chocolate bar that says 100% cacao. So what does that mean? Well, it could be a bar that's actually 100% cocoa nibs. Okay, so and if you look on the ingredient list, it should only say, right, cocoa nibs. However, you can get another bar that says 100% cacao, but turns out that it's actually a mix. It's a mix of cocoa nibs and cocoa butter. So the cocoa percentage or cacao percentage on the label is actually the sum. You add how much nib and how much cocoa butter as a percentage of the total. Okay, so a 75% cacao bar means typically that it has 75% nibs and or cocoa butter, and then 25% is sugar or something else. Okay, it could be flavorings of sugar, but typically. If you see on the 45% there, that's a milk chocolate. Again, even a milk chocolate can have a percentage. Typically, a lot of times they're not written unless you are looking at a craft chocolate bar. Even white chocolate, again, you can have a percentage on there because it's the percentage of cocoa butter that's in that bar. Okay, so that's what that means. Now you can calculate if you do the math right, and you can find out if they're adding extra cocoa butter to your bar, if it doesn't give you the exact percentage. How do you do that? Well, you can look on the back. As I mentioned, remember the nibs are 50% fat. right? So if you look at the ingredients and it says, you know, 100% cacao, and it says that this is 50% fat, that you know that it's pretty much all nibs and they didn't add anything else. If you see that the fat content is actually higher than 50%, then you know that they've added extra cocoa butter. And there's a formula you can use to figure out exactly how much. We talked about theobromine. This is the stimulant that's in caffeine. There's a couple percent of theobromine in chocolate. That's why some parents might say to their kids, don't have chocolate before you go to bed, because it will stimulate you. And it's actually related to caffeine. So if you look here on the right, caffeine, when it's metabolized or broken down in your liver, it actually produces theobromine. Okay, it's one of the metabolites. Now, theobromine is not as strong a stimulant as caffeine, but again, it does have an effect. And by the way, this is what actually will kill a dog. So when you hear that you don't want dogs to eat chocolate, it's because they cannot metabolize or break down the theobromine. And so I guess one thing that you should learn is, obviously, the darker the chocolate, the worse it is for a dog, okay? If you have a really cheap chocolate or a white chocolate, there's very little theobromine in cocoa butter. Chances are that if your dog eats your white chocolate, is not going to die, okay? Darker is the worst for dogs. Okay, the other thing you have to know, the United States is not the #1 consumer of chocolate. The United States is like 9th on the list. We eat about 10 pounds per person per year in the United States, but that is only half that of the consumption in Switzerland. They eat almost 20 pounds per person per year. So we've got a lot of room to be #1 in the chocolate world. And actually, historically, the consumption in the United States has gone up and down. We're not at the highest we've ever been. And a little fun that I've had with chocolate. The one on the left there, that rainbow pattern is not color that's in the chocolate. It's actually light that's diffracting off the surface of the chocolate. And what you can do, if you've ever gotten those glasses that kids, if you ever look up in the lights and it makes rainbows, well, that's a piece of plastic that has lines, really, really small lines sort of scratched into it. If you take your chocolate, your tempered chocolate, and you pour it on something like that, called a diffraction grating, that surface will actually imprint into the chocolate. And you can make these beautiful chocolates that will refract light and create these rainbow patterns on their surface. Okay, and the one on the right I mentioned is ruby chocolate. So this is one company is called the newest type of chocolate, right? So you know dark, you know milk, you know white. This one's called ruby. And what it is almost like a white chocolate, but it has a little bit of cocoa bean that's added to it. Now, what's different about this cocoa bean is that it's not fermented. And that unfermented cocoa bean, during the fermentation process, it turns from a purple colored bean to a brown bean, and when you roast it, to even darker brown. But if you don't ferment that bean, that cocoa bean, it actually stays purple. And what they've added, the flavor of this is sort of like a tangy, fruity chocolate. Well, it's tangy because they add citric acid. Citric acid is what makes lemons sour. So it's almost like adding like lemon juice to this. So it adds a tangy flavor. And the lemon, that's acid, actually is what changes the color as well. If you've ever taken purple cabbage and cut it up and put it in hot water, you'll end up with sort of a purple liquid. Now, if you take lemon juice and you squirt it in there, it turns it to red. Same thing here. When you add that citric acid to those unfermented beans, the purple beans turn red. And if you grind those up and put them in like a white chocolate, that white chocolate's going to turn pink. So that's ruby chocolate. You can get it. You can buy it. The first product, I believe, to use ruby chocolate was a Kit Kat. So you can go and buy a ruby chocolate Kit Kat. Tasting. So now's your chance to get out your chocolate, and I'm going to go through what the proper way to, I'll call it tasting, not eating chocolate. So first thing you need to know is that chocolate has a bunch of different flavors, and there's something called a flavor wheel. This is one from Castro Novo Chocolate in Florida. Unfortunately, unlike, let's say, coffee, there are lots of different flavor wheels. They haven't sort of come together to have one that everybody agrees on. And on the right, if you were to buy some, let's say, beans, here's a different way. This is called a spider chart, spider graph, that they'll sort of explain what the flavor is. So this bean is going to be very nutty. It will make a chocolate that is nutty and sweet and has some sort of dried and fresh fruit flavors, but it's not going to be very sort of woody. It's not going to be very spicy. So we can describe our chocolate as sort of this fruity, floral, nutty, spicy, woody, chocolatey, fudgy, people might call it. Okay. Okay, so here's if everybody can grab their chocolate in their hand, the first thing is just have a small piece, and you want to just look at your chocolate. Okay, you want to look at the color of it. Is it shiny? If it's shiny, it probably means it's tempered. Does it have any white on it? That will give you evidence if it's untempered. You can have different dark chocolates. There may be all 70% dark chocolate, and some will be really dark because of the bean or how it's roasted. Some will be very light, and you can learn by looking at it, okay? And then what you want to do is break it, okay? Break it in half, and then you want to smell it right then. And see if you get any fruit on it, if you get sort of fudgy flavors. You may not smell much at all, but when you break it, it's a good opportunity to sort of smell what's coming off. And you can just cup it in your hands and put it up to your nose, okay? Now, you're going to put that chocolate in your mouth, and most people will say, don't bite it. Just push it with your tongue to the roof of your mouth and let it melt. I cheat a little bit. I don't have that much patience. So what I do is I bite it into smaller pieces, and make sure if you do that, do it with your front teeth. Don't do it with your back teeth, your molars, because the chocolate will get stuck in your molars. And if you're tasting multiple chocolates, they could get sort of mixed. The flavors could get mixed. So I'm going to put that in my mouth now. Break it up into little pieces. I'm going to push it to the roof of my mouth. Let it melt. And you can move your tongue around and let that chocolate coat the inside of your mouth. And you want to identify, what flavors you're getting at the start, what flavors you get sort of when most of the chocolate is melted, and then what that finish is like. Mine lasted. I'm still tasting. I'm getting some fruity, like as I mentioned, sort of that sour cherry flavor in mine. It's lasting in my mouth. It hasn't gone away. I'm still tasting chocolate. Okay. Typically, if you have a chocolate lasts a long time, it means that they haven't added cocoa butter to it. Cocoa butter doesn't have much flavor, as I mentioned, and it tends to melt quickly and wash that flavor out of your mouth. Okay, and you can also taste if there are any flaws. Does it taste astringent? That means that maybe the beans weren't fermented enough, or is it a little bit bitter? And that could be that the beans were over roasted. Okay, is there any grittiness? Did you taste any grittiness in the chocolate? You can push that on the roof of your mouth and behind your teeth, and you can try to taste if you can. See if you can taste little pieces or not. Some chocolate makers will, under refine their chocolate. There are actually some chocolates that are very intentionally gritty. Okay, so and then at the end, it's really, did you enjoy it? So a little bit on chocolate opportunities. So if you want to taste a lot of chocolate, you can go to makemindefine.com. This is a site that was put up by the Fine Chocolate Industry Association. All their craft chocolate vendors that are part of this organization are making their chocolates available there. So there's some really good chocolates. I encourage you to take a chocolate making class. Obviously, all these craft chocolate makers, typically if you have one in your area, they've been having classes. Now, obviously, I don't know if they're hosting them in person right now, but you may be able to get to an online event. I encourage you to attend a show. There are lots of shows. DallasChocolate.org is doing an event where if you get a ticket, they'll send you a big box of chocolate, and you can taste and attend all these events. If you want to learn more, there are great videos and all the equipment. You can actually buy beans, or you can buy nibs at chocolatealchemy.com. And then finally, if you want different molds, you want those decorations, you can also go to chefrubber.com, which supplies all these different chocolate tiering equipment. Okay. If you want to stay connected or learn more about CocoTerra, certainly get on, have your parents, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Send us an email. You can do that through the website as well. We'd love to connect with you and talk to you more about chocolate. And now I'll open it up to any questions that you might have.
I've been compiling all the questions so far, so I can just start reading off of those if you want for now.
That'd be great.
Okay, let's start. So the first one is, what led you towards creating the startup and diving into the world of chocolate?
Ooh, that is a good question. So my brother-in-law is in the coffee business. He lives in Florida. And I took him to a chocolate tasting, and he was talking to the woman who was running the tasting, and they sort of discovered that coffee and chocolate, the whole supply and how the farmers, everything was so similar. And the woman said, well, why is it that people sort of understand the flavor, the nuance, the fine flavor of coffee more than they understand that in chocolate? And he said, well, you know, it's people actually get to make coffee at home. They have machines and they get to control the process and they pick the beans and they're involved. There's new machines that come out and it's really exciting. And that's where the conversation ended. And I thought, God, I don't know, is there a machine that can make chocolate? I didn't know. And so I started researching and found out that there isn't a single machine. There's like, you have to get all this equipment. It takes a long time. You have to learn about it. It's fairly complicated. And I thought, you know what, there has to be a better way to do this. I love making foods. I'm a beekeeper. I make wine. I've made olive oil. I've made vinegar. And I hadn't done chocolate. And that really got me excited. And eventually thought, you know what, there has to be a better way of doing this. There has to be a faster, easier method to turn these ingredients, these raw ingredients, into chocolate. And so I decided to build it and find that solution. So that's the answer.
That's awesome. Actually, it leads into the next question, which is, would you explain how your product works? Because it seems pretty complex.
Sure. So we assume that you don't have any real chocolate knowledge. So this is good for both beginners and experts. So there are recipes that run on the machine. You can download them to the machine, and it will tell you what to do. We have ingredients that we're going to make available as well. You can't go to your local supermarket and buy really good quality single origin beans. And so we will make those available. So you'll have the ingredients, you'll have the recipes, and the machine will know how to run the recipe. And so it'll tell you, okay, pour in this amount of beans. It will grind them. It'll say, okay, now it's time to put in, you know, the sugar and the spices, depending on what recipe you select. It will go through that refining process, the conching process. It will actually temper the chocolate. It'll then mold the chocolate. And then as it cools, you can eat it. So you actually don't have to know much. And the nice thing is that you're going to learn a lot as you use the machine. You'll learn a lot about the chocolate making process. And then as your expertise develop, you'll be able to customize it even more. You can actually start creating your own recipes. You can start coming up with, you know, and I did see one question about, well, can it make something other than chocolate? Yeah, you can actually put in, we make really good, I'll call it gianduja or hazelnut chocolate. Some people call it Nutella, something like that. It's really delicious. So yeah, we expect people are going to play and make all kinds of things on the machine.
Got it. Okay. Next question is, how is scented chocolate made?
Scented? I'm not sure what scented chocolate means.
I don't really know. I just got that question, but we can move on to the next one.
Yeah.
What is the Canadian Parliament's connection to chocolate?
Oh, that was, I think that's connected to the history of chocolate that I had up there.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a very good sort of historical, it was a company that was located in Canada that was looking at the history of chocolate. So that was a big connection.
Next question is, how does cocoa butter moisturize the chocolate?
So it's an oil. So if you taste oils, you know, they're very creamy, smooth. And so if you were to just, let's say, I don't know, go take cocoa powder and eat it, it's going to be very dry. It's going to be powdery. It's going to be maybe gritty or chalky. And so what happens is that the cocoa butter actually coats all those particles. So every little piece of cocoa butter, every little piece of sugar, every little piece of spice gets these cocoa butter molecules that surround it and pack around it. And so when it hits your tongue, you get, you know, the oil, the fat, which makes it creamy instead of the dry powder.
Mm-hmm. And the next question is, are cacao trees propagated from seeds or cuttings?
Oh, very good question. A little bit of both. There are entities that will send out cuttings to other, and they can graft graft onto trees. But a lot of the seedlings, I know they do graft them, but it's very easy. I mean, in the tropical regions where this grows, those seeds germinate very quickly. So a lot of times they'll just they'll grow from the seed as well.
Got it.
Awesome.
Another question is, in tempering, do you want the fat to connect? And additionally, what happens if you don't temper chocolate?
Okay, so yes, you do want the fat to connect, but you want it to connect in that form 5 crystal, okay? And you make sure that it connects in that crystal structure because you keep the temperature sort of within that, 84 to 94 degrees Fahrenheit. So only that particular crystal can form. Also, you want to make sure that those crystals don't get too big. You don't want big, long crystals of this form 5 until you're ready to let it harden. So that's why typically you're mixing the chocolate when you're tempering, you're wiping, and the wiping action does 2 things. One, it gets those crystals to line up in different ways, get them to line up properly so they do connect. But then also, if they do start getting long, you will start breaking them up. And then what happens is, so if you have, again, 1%, 3% of these crystals, then the chocolate will crystallize all pretty much mostly in this form 5, and that will be tempered. Now, if you don't, if you just take 120-degree chocolate and you put it on the counter and you let it cool, you're going to get a mix of all these different crystal structures. And that chocolate is going to turn white on the outside. If you've ever left a chocolate bar in your car and you've gone back to it, you've probably seen it sort of looks white. It maybe tastes a little bit more crumbly. And what that is, the white is, it's not bad. There's nothing wrong with the chocolate. The white is actually just pieces of the cocoa butter molecules that have been squeezed out because they didn't get crystallized perfectly well. They get squeezed to the surface. And you remember, if you saw those pictures of cocoa butter, they look white or yellow. And so that's what that white is. In fact, if you take a bar of chocolate that didn't temper, you can always just remelt it and go through the tempering process, and it's perfectly good. It's not spoiled in any way. So you're muted. There you go.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, next question is, can coffee be used as a cocoa substitute or vice versa?
It certainly can be used as a flavoring. I have made a coffee bar, meaning no cocoa nibs, but you put coffee beans in with cocoa butter and sugar, and if you want milk powder, to make essentially a coffee bar. So yeah, you can actually put both together if you want, but you can actually make a bar of coffee using cocoa butter as the fat. So, and that's quite delicious. I'm not a big coffee drinker, but people love it, and we've made that on our machine as well.
Got it. Next question is there any other usages for chocolate vinegar?
Oh, for the okay. So I'm assuming this is talking about the acid, the acetic acid that gets produced in the fermentation process. So yeah, actually, during the fermentation process, they do collect the runoff. So the first runoff before the fermentation has really started, in that first few hours or first day or so, you get actually that sweet pulp will run off, and then people collect that, and you can make a drink, and you can actually buy a cocoa pulp drink. It's quite delicious. They do actually make popsicles out of it as well, and it's delicious. That second one, remember I said that sugar then gets turned into alcohol? Well, people collect that also, and there is a alcohol drink that's made from the cocoa sugar, the pulp. I haven't heard anything about the third step, the vinegar. I don't think there's much runoff at that point. So, but that would be interesting. It would be, it's a great idea to have a cacao vinegar to make salads out of, to make your salad dressing. I'll look into it, but I haven't heard of anybody doing that.
Got it. Next question is, does chocolate have to have cocoa butter, or can it not be used?
I don't. So this gets into sort of legal definitions, like FDA and international definitions of chocolate. I don't think it has to have cocoa butter, meaning added cocoa butter. So in fact, there's a chocolate maker here in San Francisco called Dandelion. They only do 2-ingredient chocolate. It's only nibs and sugar. So there's no added cocoa butter. But remember, the cocoa bean the nibs are 50% cocoa butter. So the question is, can you make, yes, you can take cocoa powder and get butter and like real dairy butter and make a chocolate out of that. It'll taste different, but that is a way of sort of making chocolate at home really fast. It'll probably be a little bit gritty if you use powdered sugar and cocoa powder and butter. That will make a chocolate of sorts.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And then another question is, what does the pulp taste like?
So very tropical, fruity. So maybe pineapple, maybe mango, maybe some banana in there as well. It's quite delicious, and also it depends on when you're eating the fruit. So like most fruit, it ripens, and so there's a little more acidity to it in the beginning, and as it ripens, it gets just sweeter, much more sweet, like most any fruit. So. But I encourage you can go online. I haven't checked online whether you can buy the drink, but I know there are a few companies that are making that. I think South America.
Got it. Okay. And then how do you make ruby chocolate?
So if you wanted to make ruby chocolate at home, you would have to, the hardest part is you have to get unfermented beans, and that's typically not available. But you could probably get something that tastes a lot like it, and you could color it if you just take red food coloring, and you can buy citric acid and you make a white chocolate, and you added a little bit of citric acid and food coloring to it. My guess is it would taste a lot like ruby chocolate. If you really wanted to make a true ruby, you have to get these unfermented beans, get citric acid, and then I think it's about 5% of this acidified unfermented beans that gets added to like a white chocolate recipe.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. And finally, or not finally, can you use your machine for anything else, such as carob beans?
Such as which?
Carob beans.
Oh, carob?
Yeah, carob.
That's a good question. We haven't tried grinding up carob. What's interesting, so the machine, if it's something that's really soft, it won't grind well. And if it's really hard, it won't grind well. So there are some sort of limits to what it can do. I don't know about carob. I do see something on why chocolates get hard. So I'll touch on that just quickly. Most fats crystallize, right? They harden. And they do it at different temperatures. So for example, olive oil, at room temperature, right, it's liquid. But if you take olive oil and you put it in your refrigerator or put it in the freezer, it's going to get hard. It's going to crystallize. And depending on the fat and the mixture of fats, that temperature changes. In fact, when you add milk powder to chocolate, to cocoa butter, it changes the crystallization temperatures. In fact, that chart that I showed you, that's a dark chocolate tempering chart. For milk chocolate, it's a few degrees lower. For white chocolate, it's a few degrees lower. So different fats and mixtures of different fats have different hardening temperatures. And it just has to do with, it's like water, right? Think about water. Well, at room temperature, it's liquid, and eventually if it gets cold enough, those water molecules stop moving and they start connecting to each other and they get hard. So the same thing with fat, same thing with water molecules.
Got it. And finally, for the multi set, should it be cooled and refrigerated, or should it be left at room temperature?
Um, yes, so this is important. So if you always want to make sure that your chocolate stays below 90 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Because once it gets above 90, it's going to start losing its temper, or it'll start forming that form 6 crystal much faster. You can store it in a refrigerator. I would prefer to store it in some place that's just cool and where the temperature doesn't change too much. The one thing you have to be careful of is if you put chocolate in a freezer or in a refrigerator, you can get, when you take it out, the water can condense on the outside of that chocolate, and what will happen is the water that condenses will actually dissolve the sugar that it has access to on the surface, and then it can start creating patterns. It can start making your chocolate a little bit sticky from the dissolved sugar. So I typically will just store mine in a cool place, keep it out of the sun, keep it dry. If you don't have a place that stays cool, then yeah, a refrigerator is probably your next best alternative.
Mm-hmm. Just does dark chocolate turn white or fade in color due to being in the fridge like that?
The color won't fade. Again, it turns white when it loses its temper. Even when actually the form 5 to form 6 typically doesn't turn white. It might a little bit on the surface, but the time that it really turns white is when it heats up and it sort of starts melting and loses its crystal structure, and then it starts recrystallizing. That's really when it'll turn very white.
Mm-hmm. Do you know which country is the leading producer of cocoa beans, and also what country exports the most chocolate?
Ooh, what country exports the most chocolate? I would imagine Switzerland, but I actually don't know off the top of my head. I know, sort of Italy, Germany, Switzerland, and England, right? UK. Mm-hmm. They have Cadbury. I mean, they have a lot of big brands. Obviously, we are not the largest consumer of chocolate, but the largest producer, so West Africa, so Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, are the #1 producers in the world. They produce most of the world's chocolate. And then you've had others. Argentina used to be a big producer. They're still in the top 10. And different countries in Mexico, Central America. You have other countries they're starting to produce more. India is starting to produce. So it's really interesting. Indonesia as well, one of the larger producers. So there are lots of really interesting countries and flavor profiles that are now becoming available. So you can, again, go to those sites that I mentioned earlier, and you can see all the different countries and origins that they have.
Got it. There's just a few left. So do you know what makes Belgian or Swiss chocolate special?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, if you look at the composition of the different chocolates, you add extra cocoa butter, which makes the chocolate really creamy. So if you're willing to add a lot of cocoa butter to your chocolate, then that's considered. I don't, whether let's say Belgium or Switzerland, whether their chocolate is, I think they're getting their cacao from the same place as everybody else. It's their recipes and how long they make conch it and how much fat they put in it, I think, is what distinguishes them. And let me add one more question that wasn't asked, which is, what's the difference between a chocolate maker and a chocolatier? So a chocolate maker is someone who actually takes the basic ingredients and turns them into chocolate, whereas a chocolatier typically buys chocolate and turns it into a confection, meaning, right, a truffle, a bonbon, a praline. And so they're buying already made chocolate. A chocolatier is buying already made chocolate, whereas a chocolate maker is getting the raw ingredients and turning them into chocolate. So that's really when people, sometimes they use those interchangeably, but they're very different. Now, somebody can be both a chocolate maker and a chocolatier, but that's less common. Most chocolatiers are buying chocolate from big manufacturers.
That's really cool. And do you have any thoughts on how we could resolve the cacao problem?
Well, as I mentioned, there are a number of problems that you can identify in the supply chain. Going from labor issues, harvesting, right, to organic, to not destroying the the rainforest to, you know, making sure they're using organic methods. You know, what I would say is, depending on what's important to you, look at the label. And there are a lot of organizations that are monitoring this. And I would say only buy chocolate that meets your values. And that's the best way that you can have an impact, right? So if making sure that this is sustainably grown, make sure that you buy chocolate that's Rainforest Alliance certified. Or that's ethically harvested. And there are different organizations, and you'll find those different certifications on the bar. But again, you have to do the research, because it's even more complicated than that, because organic, as I mentioned, these are small family farms. For a family to get organic certified can be very expensive. It could be cost prohibitive. So while they may be organically growing, right, they may not be able to afford an organic certification.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually have to do the research and find out what company or what organization is helping to grow and source and import that chocolate, those beans. And even though it may not have an organic certification or a Rainforest Alliance or fair trade, it may be that chocolate is being grown properly, harvested properly, the farmers are getting paid properly. But at the end of the day, I think it's vote with your wallet, buy chocolate that matches your value system. And the market will respond if enough people do that. Thank you.
And on a more personal note, do you prefer conched or unconched chocolate? And do you believe chocolate is good or bad for you?
I believe dark chocolate is good for you. I think the milk chocolate that you probably, industrial milk chocolate that you buy in the stores is probably not very good for you. I'm ambivalent to the conching. I typically, when I make chocolate on our machine, I'm typically not going through a long conch process, and I enjoy the chocolate. So I'm a believer that if you start with good beans, you don't need to conch your chocolate as much. And if you have off flavors, right? I mean, you have to think about, there are chocolate makers that are sort of like the McDonald's, right, of the world, where you want that burger to taste the same anywhere you buy it, any year, any restaurant in any country of the world. And there's chocolate like that as well, right? You want it to taste the same. Doesn't matter when you buy it, what year, what holiday. And so what they want to do is essentially take out all the flavor, all the things that are unique about that flavor, roast it a lot. So it's dark roast, so it always tastes the same. To me, that's not quality chocolate. So that's the bigger issue for me, is whether it's a fine chocolate or whether it's sort of industrial quality, low quality chocolate.
Right. And we just have like a couple more questions.
Sure.
How do you make hollow chocolate? So like rabbits and stuff.
So typically, if you want to make a hollow chocolate, what you do is you have what's called a two-part mold. So you have imagine that the two halves of my hands are a mold. And what I'll do is I'll pour chocolate into this one half. I don't fill it up all the way. I only fill it up a little bit, and I roll it around so it coats that mold, and then I dump the rest out. And what happens is you're going to get a thin layer of chocolate coating this side. I do the same here. And then if I do it fast enough, I can just connect the two halves together. Right? Or I can warm the edges so they're a little bit melted, and I connect them together, and you're going to get a hollow ball of chocolate. So if you're making hollowed bunnies or hollowed eggs, it's typically done with a two-part mold. And it's also what they do to make filled chocolates. If you want a chocolate that has something inside of it, what you do is you get a mold which has all the little cups in them. You pour chocolate into that, you move it around a little bit, and you actually dump it upside down. Now, some chocolate is going to stay coated on that mold. You let it harden, and then you fill each one of those little pockets, okay, most of the way up, but not completely. And then what you do is you take your melted chocolate again, you pour it on the top, and you wipe it with a knife or a flat spatula, and that seals the top, which becomes the bottom. Okay, you let it harden, and then you drop them out, and you have these perfectly, beautifully filled chocolates.
Got it. Do you know how do people make hybrid cacao species? Someone asks.
So most of the hybridization that's happened has happened naturally. There are a lot of breeding projects and programs that are happening through different universities and different organizations, there are some really bad diseases that have spread through the cacao growing community. Brazil used to be a major grower, and it got decimated by a disease. And so they're trying to find cacao varietals that are resistant to some of these infections. I mean, in fact, a lot of times you can't import or export cacao or pods or beans, seeds into different countries because they're worried about spreading this infection. And so what they'll do literally is that if you cross-pollinate 2 different trees, right, and then you just take the pod from that tree and you leave the seeds out, they'll start germinating. Literally in a few days, the root starts growing and the plant starts growing, and you have a new genetic mix of this tree A and tree B.
Wow.
And then you have to test and see, okay, well, how resistant is this tree to your disease, if that's what you're selecting for. So they select for, right, how many pods it produces, how quickly it produces, what the flavor is, disease resistance. There are lots of different, the size of the pods, lots of different factors and traits that they select for.
Right. Do you also know if the color is of the pods are dependent on the kind of tree it is?
No, so you can get different. I mean, most trees will produce the same colored pods, but even in the same type and different trees I've seen have different colors. They do change over time as well. So they'll start off, let's say, green. They can start off green and turn yellow. You actually you can scratch the surface of a pod. And if it's sort of like a orange color underneath, then you know that that pod is ripe and ready to harvest. There are about 2 harvests per year typically in most cacao plantations or farms. Yeah, and a lot of times you'll see different shapes, the way the top of the pod looks, the color, the size, all those are typically also connected to the genetics of the variety.
Got it. And for the penultimate question, do you know how the process is different between white chocolate and dark chocolate in terms of like the steps that you take and everything?
Right. So I didn't go into some of the differences there. It's much the same. The biggest difference is that you're not going to do that first grind step where you're grinding the nibs. There are no nibs, so you don't do that grind step. So typically you can think of it as just skipping that step. So you just combine your cocoa butter, your sugar, and your milk powder, and you refine it. And you want to get it down to, again, that sort of 20 micron particle size. You're still going to temper it. As I mentioned, the tempering target temperatures are a little bit lower for white chocolate than they are for dark chocolate. But the process, the time it takes, at least in my experience, is much the same. It's just cutting out that first step.
Okay. And for the final question, will you ship us chocolate? Someone asked.
That's a great question. I don't have anybody's addresses. Shipping chocolate, so interestingly, is quite hard. It's difficult because you have to worry about the temperatures. So if you think about any package that gets left in the back of the mail truck, or gets left in the back of a UPS truck, 90 degrees, above 90 degrees, and the temperature is too high and it'll ruin the chocolate. So a lot of chocolate makers, you'll see or realize they won't ship chocolate during the summer. And you'll notice there are not a lot of online chocolate companies that are selling bars because it's really expensive to package up that chocolate. Typically it has to be sent next day, 2-day, in insulation. So it's a great question. It's actually quite complicated and very expensive to ship chocolate. So that's why I sort of suggest if you want fresh chocolate, make it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. That's it for today. But thank you so much for doing this whole seminar. It was awesome.
Yes, thank you so much, Nate.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed this session.
Mm-hmm.